The man who played upon the leaf. Where the Jura pines pushed the fringe of their purple cloak down the slopes till the vineyards stopped them lest they should troop into the lake of Neuchâtel, you may find the village where lived the man who played upon the leaf. My first sight of him was genuinely prophetic, that spring evening in the garden café of the little mountain auberge. But before I saw him, I heard him, and ever afterwards the sound and the sight have remained inseparable in my mind. Jean Grospierre and Louis Favre were giving me confused instructions. The Vin Rouge of Neuchâtel is heady, you know. As to the best route up the Tête d'Orange, when a thin wailing music that at first I took to be rising wind made itself heard suddenly among the apple trees at the end of the garden, and riveted my attention with a thrill of I know not what. Favre's description of the bridle path over Mont Racine died away. Then Grospierre's eyes wandered as he too stopped to listen. And at the same moment a mongrel dog of indescribably forlorn appearance came whining about our table under the walnut tree. "Espérez comment va, the man who plays on the leaf," said Favre.
"And his cursed dog,"
added Grospierre with a shrug of disgust. And after a pause they fell again to quarreling about my complicated path up the Tête d'Orange. I turned from them in the direction of the sound. The dusk was falling. Through the trees I saw the vineyards, sloping down a mile or two to the dark blue lake, with its distant shadowed shore and the white line of misty Alps in the sky beyond. Behind us the forests rose in folded purple ridges to the heights of Baudry and La Tourne, soft and thick like carpets of cloud. There was no one about in the cabaret. I heard a horse's hoofs in the village street, a rattle of pans from the kitchen, and the soft roar of a train climbing the mountain railway through gathering darkness towards France, and singing through it all like a thread of silver through a dream this sweet and windy music. But at first there was nothing to be seen. The man who played on the leaf was not visible, though I stared hard at the place whence the sound apparently proceeded. The effect for a moment was almost ghostly. Then, down there among the shadows of fruit trees and small pines, something moved, and I became aware with a start that the little sapin I had been looking at all the time was really not a tree, but a man, hatless, with a dark face, loose hair, and wearing a pèlerin over his shoulders. How he had produced this singularly vivid impression, and taken upon himself the outline and image of a tree, is utterly beyond me to describe. It was doubtless some swift suggestion in my own imagination that deceived me. Yet he was thin, small, straight, and his flying hair and spreading pèlerin somehow pictured themselves in the network of dusk and background, into the semblance, I suppose, of branches. I merely record my impression with the truest available words. Also my instant persuasion that this first view of the man was, after all, significant and prophetic. His dominant characteristics presented themselves to me symbolically. I saw the man first as a tree. I heard his music first as wind. Then, as he came slowly towards us, it was clear that he produced the sound by blowing upon a leaf held to his lips between tightly closed hands. And at his feet followed the mongrel dog.
"The inseparables,"
sneered Grospierre, who did not appreciate the interruption. He glanced contemptuously at the man and the dog, his face and manner, it seemed to me, conveying a mere trace, however, of superstitious fear.
"The tune your father taught you, Hein,"
he added, with a cruel allusion I did not at the moment understand.
"Hush,"
Favre said.
"He plays thunderingly well all the time."
His glass had not been emptied quite so often, and in his eyes as he listened there was a touch of something that was between respect and wonder.
"The music of the devil,"
Grospierre muttered as he turned with a gesture of surly impatience to the wine and the rye bread.
"It makes me dream at night. Ugh."
The man, paying no attention to the jibes, came closer, continuing his leaf music, and as I watched and listened, the thrill that had first stirred in me grew curiously. To look at, he was perhaps 40, perhaps 50, worn, thin, broken, and something seizingly pathetic in his appearance told its little wordless story into the air. The stamp of the outcast was mercilessly upon him. But the eyes were dark and fine. They proclaimed the possession of something that was neither worn nor broken, something that was proud to be outcast and welcomed it.
He's craggy, you know,
explained Favre,
and half-blind. He lives in that hut on the edge of the forest,
pointing with his thumb toward Cotendard,
and plays on the leaf for what he can earn.
We listened for 5 minutes perhaps while this singular being stood there in the dusk and piped his weird tunes, and if imagination had influenced my first sight of him, it certainly had nothing to do with what I now heard, for it was unmistakable. The man played not merely tunes and melodies, but the clean, strong, elemental sounds of nature, especially the crying voices of wind. It was the raw material, if you like, of what the masters have used here and there, Wagner and so forth, but by him heard closely and wonderfully, and produced with marvelous accuracy. It was now the notes of birds or the tinkle and rustle of sounds heard in groves and copses, and now the murmur of those airs that lose their way on summer noons among the treetops. And then, quite incredibly, just as the man came closer and the volume increased, it grew to the crying of bigger winds and the whispering rush of rain among tossed branches. How he produced it passed my comprehension, but I think he somehow mingled his own voice with the actual notes of the vibrating edge of the leaf. Perhaps, too, that the strange passion shaking behind it all in the depths of the bewildered spirit poured out and reached my mind by ways unknown and incalculable. I must have momentarily lost myself in the soft magic of it, for I remember coming back with a start to notice that the man had stopped, and that his melancholy face was turned to me with a smile of comprehension and sympathy that passed again almost before I had time to recognize it, and certainly before I had time to reply. And this time I am ready to admit that it was my own imagination, singularly stirred, that translated his smile into the words that no one else heard. I was playing for you, because you understand. Favre was standing up, and I saw him give the man the half-loaf of coarse bread that was on the table, offering also his own partly emptied wine-glass.
I haven't a sou today,
he was saying,
but if you're hungry, mon brave.
And the man, refusing the wine, took the bread with an air of dignity that precluded all suggestion of patronage or favor, and ought to have made Favre feel proud that he had offered it.
And that for his son,
laughed the stupid Grospierre, tossing a cheese rind to the dog.
Or for his forest god.
The music was about me like a net that still held my words and thoughts in a delicate bondage, which is my only explanation for not silencing the coarse guide in the way he deserved. But a few minutes later, when the men had gone into the inn, I crossed to the end of the garden, and there, where the perfumes of orchard and forest deliciously mingled, I came upon the man sitting on the grass beneath an apple tree. The dog, wagging its tail, was at his feet, as he fed it with the best and largest portions of the bread. For himself, it seemed, he kept nothing but the crust, and, what I could hardly believe had I not actually witnessed it, the cur, though clearly not hungry, had to be coaxed with smiles and kind words to eat what it realized in some dear dog fashion was needed even more by its master. A pair of outcasts, they looked indeed, sharing dry bread in the back garden of the village inn. But in the soft, discerning eyes of that mangy creature there was an expression that raised it, for me at least, far beyond the ranks of common curdom. And in the eyes of the man, half-witted and pariah as he undoubtedly was, a look that set him somewhere in a lonely place where he heard the still, small voices of the world, and moved with the elemental tides of life that are never outcast, and that include the farthest suns. He took the franc I offered, and closer I perceived that his eyes, for all their moments of fugitive brilliance, were indeed half sightless, and that perhaps he saw only well enough to know men as trees talking. In the village, some said he saw better than most, that he saw in the dark, possibly even into the peopled regions beyond this world. And there were reasons, uncanny reasons, to explain the belief. I only know at any rate that from this first moment of our meeting he never failed to recognize me at a considerable distance, and to be aware of my whereabouts even in the woods at night. And the best explanation I ever heard, though of course unscientific, was Louis Favre's whispered communication that
he sees with the whole surface of his skin.
He took the franc with the same air of grandeur that he took the bread, as though he conferred a favor, yet was grateful. The beauty of that gesture has often come back to me since, with a sense of wonder for the sweet nobility that I afterwards understood inspired it. At the same time, however, he merely looked up at me with the remark,
C'est pour la Dieu. Merci.
He did not say, Le bon Dieu, as everyone else did. And though I had meant to get into conversation with him, I found no words quickly enough, for he at once stood up and began to play again on his leaf. And while he played his thanks and gratitude, or the thanks and gratitude of his god, that shaggy mongrel dog stopped eating and sat up beside him to listen. Both fixed their eyes upon me as the sounds of wind and birds and forest poured softly and wonderfully about my ears, so that, when it was over and I went down the quiet street to my pension, I was aware that some tiny sense of bewilderment had crept into the profounder regions of my consciousness and faintly disturbed my normal conviction that I belonged to the common world of men as of old. Some aspect of the village, especially the human occupants in it, had secretly changed for me. Those pearly spaces of sky where the bats flew over the red roofs seemed more alive, more exquisite than before. The smells of the open stables where the cows stood munching, more fragrant than usual of sweet animal life that included myself delightfully keenly. The last chatterings of the sparrows under the eaves of my own pension, more intimate and personal. Almost as if those strands of elemental music the man played on his leaf had, for the moment, made me free of the life of the earth, as distinct from the life of man. I can only suggest this, and leave the rest to the care of the imaginative reader, for it is impossible to say along what inner byways of fancy I reached the conclusion that when the man spoke of the God, and not the good God, he intended to convey his sense of some great woodland personality, some spirit of the forests, whom he knew and loved and worshipped, and whom he was intuitively aware I also knew and loved and worshipped. During the next few weeks, I came to learn more about this poor, half-witted man. In the village, he was known as Perrette Comment va, the man who plays on the leaf. But when the people wished to be more explicit, they described him as the man without parents and without God. The origin of Comment va I never discovered, but the other titles were easily explained. He was illegitimate, an outcast. The mother had been a wandering Italian girl, and the father a loose-living Boucheron, who was, it seems, a standing disgrace to the community. I think the villagers were not conscious of their severity. The older generation of farmers and vignerons had pity, but the younger ones and those of his own age were certainly guilty, if not of deliberate cruelty, at least of a harsh neglect and the utter withholding of sympathy. It was like the thoughtless cruelty of children, due to small unwisdom and to that absence of charity which is based on ignorance. They could not in the least understand this crazy, picturesque being who wandered day and night in the forests and spoke openly, though never quite intelligibly, of worshipping another god than their own anthropomorphic deity. People looked askance at him because he was queer. A few feared him. One or two I found later. All women felt vaguely that there was something in him rather wonderful. They hardly knew what, that lifted him beyond the reach of village taunts and sneers. But from all he was remote, alien, solitary, an outcast and a pariah. It so happened that I was very busy at the time, seeking the seclusion of the place for my work, and rarely going out until the day was failing. And so it was, I suppose, that my sight of the man was always associated with a gentle dusk, long shadows and slanting rays of sunlight. Every time I saw that thin, straight, yet broken figure, every time the music of the leaf reached me, there came too the inexplicable thrill of secret wonder and delight that had first accompanied his presence, and with it the subtle suggestion of a haunted woodland life, beautiful with new values. To this day I see that sad, dark face moving about the street, touched with melancholy yet with the singular light of an inner glory that sometimes lit flames in the poor eyes. Perhaps the fancy entered my thoughts sometimes when I passed him. Those who are all out of their minds, as the saying goes, are at the same time half in another region, whose penetrating loveliness has so bewildered and amazed them that they no longer can play their dull part in our commonplace world. And certainly for me, this man's presence never failed to convey an awareness of some hidden and secret beauty that he knew apart from the ordinary haunts and pursuits of men. Often I followed him up into the woods, in spite of the menacing growls of the dog, who invariably showed his teeth lest I should approach too close, with a great longing to know what he did there and how he spent his time wandering in the great forests. Sometimes, I was assured, staying out entire nights or remaining away for days together. For in these Jura forests that covered the mountains from Neuchâtel to Yverdon, and stretched thickly up to the very frontiers of France, you may walk for days without finding a farm or meeting more than an occasional bûcheron. And at length, after weeks of failure and by some process of sympathy, he apparently communicated in turn to the dog, it came about that I was accepted. I was allowed to follow at a distance, to listen, and, if I could, to watch. I make use of the conditional, because once in the forest this man had the power of concealing himself in the same way that certain animals and insects conceal themselves, by choosing places instinctively where the color of their surroundings merge into their outlines and obliterate them. So long as he moved, all was well, but the moment he stopped and a chance dell or cluster of trees intervened, I lost sight of him, and more than once passed within a foot of his presence without knowing it, though the dog was plainly there at his feet. And the instant I turned at the sound of the leaf, there he was, leaning against some dark tree stem, part of a shadow perhaps, growing like a forest thing out of the thick moss that hid his feet, or merging with extraordinary intimacy into the fronds of some drooping pine bough. Moreover, this concealment was never intentional, it seems, but instinctive. The life to which he belonged took him close to its heart, draping about the starved and wasted shoulders the cloak of kindly sympathy which the world of men denied him. And while I took my place some little way off upon a fallen stem, and the dog sat looking up into his face with its eyes of yearning and affection, Père Comment va would take a leaf from the nearest ivy, raise it between tightly pressed palms to his lips, and begin that magic sound that seemed to rise out of the forest voices themselves rather than to be a thing apart. It was a late evening towards the end of May when I first secured this privilege at close quarters, and the memory of it lives in me still with the fragrance and wonder of some incredible dream. The forest just there was scented with wild lilies of the valley which carpeted the more open spaces with their white bells and big green leaves. Patches and violets and pale anemone twinkled down the mossy stairways of every glade, and through slim openings among the pine stems I saw the shadowed blues of the lake beyond, and the far line of the high Alps, soft and cloud-like in the sky. Already the woods were drawing the dusk out of the earth to cloak themselves for sleep, and in the east a rising moon stared close over the ground between the big trees, dropping trails of faint and yellowish silver along the moss. Distant cowbells and an occasional murmur of village voices reached the ear, but a deep hush lay over all that mighty slope of mountain forest, and even the footsteps of ourselves and the dog had come to rest. Then, as sounds heard in a dream, a breeze stirred the topmost branches of the pines, filtering down to us as from the wings of birds. It brought new odors of sky and sun-kissed branches with it. A moment later it lost itself in the darkening aisles of forest beyond, and out of the stillness that followed I heard the strange music of the leaf rising about us with its extraordinary power of suggestion. And turning to see the face of the player more closely, I saw that it had marvelously changed, had become young, unlined, soft with joy. The spirit of the immense woods possessed him, and he was at peace. While he played too, he swayed a little to and fro, just as a slender sapin sways in wind, and a revelation came to me of that strange beauty of combined sound and movement. Trees bending while they sing, branches trembling and a whisper, children that laugh while they dance. And oh, the crying, plaintive notes of that leaf, and the profound sense of elemental primitive sound that they woke in the penetralia of the imagination, subtly linking simplicity to grandeur. Terribly yet sweetly penetrating how they searched the heart through and troubled the very sources of life. Often and often since I have wondered what it was in that singular music that made me know the distant Alps listened in their sky spaces, and that the purple slopes of Boudry and Mont Racine bore it along the spires of their woods as though giant harp strings stretched to the far summits of Chacharal and the arid wastes of Tête d'Orange. In the music this outcast played upon the leaf, there was something of a wild, mad beauty that plunged like a knife to the home of tears, and at the same time sang out beyond them. Something coldly elemental, close to the naked heart of life. The truth, doubtless, was that his strains, making articulate the sounds of nature, touched deep, primitive yearnings that, for many, are buried beyond recall. And between the airs, even between the bars, there fell deep weeping silences when the sound merged themselves into the sigh of wind or the murmur of falling water, just as the strange player merging his body into the form and color of the trees about him. And when at last he ceased, I went close to him, hardly knowing what it was I wanted so much to ask or say. He straightened up at my approach. The melancholy dropped its veil upon his face instantly. "But that was beautiful. Unearthly," I faltered. "You never have played like that in the village." And for a second his eyes lit up as he pointed to the dark spaces of forest behind us. "And there," he said softly, "there is light." "You heard true music in these woods," I ventured, hoping to draw him out. "This music you play, this exquisite singing of winds and trees?" He looked at me with a puzzled expression, and I knew, of course, that I had blundered with my banal words. Then, before I could explain or alter, there floated to us through the trees a sound of church bells from villages far away. And instantly, as he heard, his face grew dark, as though he understood in some vague fashion that it was a symbol of the faith of those parents who had wronged him, and of the people who continually made him suffer. Something of this, I feel sure, passed through his tortured mind, for he looked menacingly about him, and the dog, who caught the shadow of all his moods, began to growl angrily. "My music," he said with a sudden abruptness that was almost fierce, "is for my god." "Your god of the forests?" I said with a real sympathy that I believe reached him. Pour ça. I play it all over the world." He looked about him down the slopes of villages and vineyards. "And for those who understand, those who belong, to come." He was, I felt sure, going to say more, perhaps to unbosom himself to me a little, and I might have learned something of the ritual this self-appointed priest of Pan followed in his forest temples, when the sound of the bells swelled suddenly on the wind, and he turned with an angry gesture and made to go. Their insolence, penetrating even to the privacy of his secret woods, was too much for him. "And you find many?" I asked. Père Comment va shrugged his shoulders and smiled pityingly. "Moi? Puis le chien? Puis maintenant vous?" He was gone the same minute, as if the branches stretched out dark arms to draw him away among them. And on my way back to the village by the growing light of the moon, I heard far away in that deep world of a million trees the echoes of a weird sweet music, as this unwitting votary of Pan piped and fluted to his mighty god upon an ivy leaf. And the last thing I actually saw was the mongrel cur turning back from the edge of the forest to look at me for a moment of hesitation. He thought it was time now that I should join the little band of worshippers and follow them to the haunted spots of worship. "Moi, puis le chien, puis maintenant vous." From that moment of speech, a kind of unexpressed intimacy between us came into being, and whenever we passed one another in the street, he would give me a swift, happy look, and jerk his head significantly towards the forests. The feeling that, perhaps in his curious, lonely existence I counted for something important, made me very careful with him. From time to time I gave him a few francs, and regularly, twice a week when I knew he was away, I used to steal unobserved to his hut on the edge of the forest and put parcels of food inside the door. Salami, cheese, bread. And on one or two occasions when I had been extravagant with my own tea, pieces of plum cake, what the Colombier baker calls bloemkak. He never acknowledged these little gifts, and I sometimes wondered to what use he put them, for though the dog remained well-favored, so far as any cur can be so, he himself seemed to waste away more rapidly than ever. I found, too, that he did receive help from the village, official help, but that after the night when he was caught on the church steps with an oil can, kindling wood, and a box of matches, this help was reduced by half, and the threat made to discontinue it altogether. Yet I feel sure there was no inherent maliciousness in the man who played upon the leaf, and that his hatred of an alien faith was akin to the mistaken zeal that in other days could send poor sinners to the stake for the ultimate safety of their souls. Two things, moreover, helped to foster the tender belief I had in his innate goodness. First, that all the children of the village loved him and were unafraid to the point of playing with him and pulling him about as though he were a big dog. And secondly, that his devotion for the mongrel hound, his equal and fellow worshipper, went to the length of genuine self-sacrifice. I could never forget how he fed it with the best of the bread, when his own face was pinched and drawn with hunger. And on other occasions I saw many similar proofs of his unselfish affection. His love for that mongrel, never uttered, in my presence at least, perhaps unrecognized as love even by himself, must surely have risen in some form of music or incense to sweeten the very halls of heaven. In the woods I came across him anywhere and everywhere, sometimes so unexpectedly that it occurred to me he must have followed me stealthily for long distances, and once in that very lonely stretch above the mountain railway, towards Montmalin, where the trees are spaced apart with an effect of cathedral aisles and Gothic arches, he caught me suddenly and did something that for a moment caused me a thrill of genuine alarm. Wild lilies of the valley grow very thickly thereabouts, and the ground falls into a natural hollow that shuts it off from the rest of the forest, with a peculiar and delightful sense of privacy. And when I came across it for the first time, I stopped with a sudden feeling of quite bewildering enchantment, with a kind of childish awe that caught my breath as though I had slipped through some fairy door, or blundered out of the ordinary world into a place of holy ground, where solemn and beautiful things were the order of the day. I waited a moment and looked about me. It was utterly still. The haze of the day had given place to an evening clarity of atmosphere that gave the world an appearance of having just received its finishing touches of pristine beauty. The scent of the lilies was overpoweringly sweet, but the whole first impression, before I had time to argue it away, was that I stood before some mighty chancel steps on the eve of a secret festival of importance, and that all was prepared and decorated with a view to the coming ceremony. The hush was the most delicate and profound imaginable, almost forbidding. I was a rude disturber. Then, without any sound of approaching footsteps, my hat was lifted from my head, and when I turned with a sudden start of alarm, there before me stood Père Commonvat, the man who played upon the leaf. An extraordinary air of dignity hung about him. His face was stern yet rapt, something in his eyes genuinely impressive, and his whole appearance produced the instant impression, it touched me with a fleeting sense of awe, that here I had come upon him in the very act, had surprised this poor broken being in some dramatic moment when his soul sought to find its own peculiar region, and to transform itself into loveliness through some process of outward worship. He handed the hat back to me without a word, and I understood that I had unwittingly blundered into the secret place of his strange cult, some shrine, as it were, haunted doubly by his faith and imagination, perhaps even into his very holy of holies. His own head, as usual, was bared. I could no more have covered myself again than I could have put my hat on in communion service of my own church. But this wonderful place, this peace, this silence, I murmured with the best manner of apology for the intrusion I could muster on the instant. May I stay a little with you, perhaps, and see? And his face passed almost immediately when he realized that I understood into that soft and happy expression the woods invariably drew out upon it, the look of the soul, complete and healed. Hush, he whispered, his face solemn with the mystery of the listening trees. Vous êtes un peu en retard, mais pourtant. And lifting the leaf to his lips, he played a soft and whirring music that had for its undercurrent the sounds of running water and singing wind mingled exquisitely together. It was half chant, half song, solemn enough for the dead, yet with a strain of soaring joy in it that made me think of children and a perfect faith. The music blessed me, and the leagues of forest listening poured about us all their healing forces. I swear it would not have greatly surprised me to see the shaggy flanks of Pan himself disappearing behind the moss-grown boulders that lay about the hollows, or to have caught the flutter of white limbs as the nymphs stepped to the measure of his tune through the mosaic of slanting sunshine and shadow beyond. Instead, I saw only that picturesque madman playing upon his ivy leaf, and at his feet the faithful dog, staring up without blinking into his face, from time to time turning to make sure that I listened and understood. But the desolate places drew him most, and no distance seemed too great either for himself or his dog. In this part of the Jura there is scenery of a somber and impressive grandeur that, in its way, is quite as majestic as the revelation of far bigger mountains. The general appearance of soft blue pine woods is deceptive. The Boudry cliffs, slashed here and there with inaccessible couleurs, are undeniably grand, and in the sweep of the Croix de Vent precipices there is a splendid terror quite as solemn as that of Matterhorn itself. The shadows of its smooth circular walls deny the sun all day, and the winds, caught within the 700-foot sides of its huge amphitheater, as in the hollow of some awful cup, boom and roar with the crying of lost thunders. I often met him in these lonely fastnesses, wearing that half-bewildered, half-happy look of the wandering child. And one day in particular, when I risked my neck scrambling up the most easterly of the Boudry couleurs, I learned afterwards that he had spent the whole time, 4 hours and more, on the little Champ de Tremont at the bottom, watching me with his dog till I arrived in safety at the top. His fellow worshippers were few, he explained, and worth keeping, though it was ever inexplicable to me how his poor damaged eyes performed the marvels of sight they did. And another time at night, when I admit no sane man should have been abroad, and I'd lost my way coming home from a climb along the torn and precipitous ledges of La Tourne, I heard his leaf thinly piercing the storm, always in front of me, yet never overtaken, a sure though invisible guide. The cliffs on that descent are sudden and treacherous. The torrent of the Arouse, swollen with the melting snows, thundered ominously far below, and the forests swung their vast wet cloaks about them with torrents of blinding rain and clouds of darkness, yet all fragrant with warm wind as a virgin world answering to its first spring tempest. There he was, the outcast with his leaf, playing to his god amid all these crashings and bellowings. In the night, too, when skies were quiet and stars agleam, or in the still watches before the dawn, I would sometimes wake with the sound of clustered branches combing faint music from the gently rising wind, and figure to myself that strange lost creature wandering with his dog and leaf, his pèlerin, his flying hair, his sweet rapt expression of an inner glory, out there among the world of swaying trees he loved so well. And then my first soft view of the man would come back to me when I had seen him in the dusk as a tree, as though by some queer optical freak my outer and my inner vision had mingled so that I perceived both his broken body and his soul of magic. For the mysterious singing of the leaf, heard in such moments from my window while the world slept, expressed absolutely the inmost cry of that lonely and singular spirit, damaged in the eyes of the village beyond repair, but in the sight of the wood gods he so devoutly worshipped, made whole with their own peculiar loveliness and fashioned after the image of elemental things. The spring wonder was melting into the peace of the long summer days when the end came. The vineyards had begun to dress themselves in green, and the forest in those soft blues, when individual trees lose their outline in the general body of the mountain. The lake was indistinguishable from the sky, the Jura peaks and ridges gone a-soaring into misty distances, the white Alps withdrawn into inaccessible and remote solitudes of heaven. I was making reluctant preparations for leaving, dark London already in my thoughts, when the news came. I forgot who first put it into actual words. It had been about the village all the morning, and something of it was in every face as I went down the street. But the moment I came out and saw the dog on my doorstep, looking up at me with puzzled and beseeching eyes, I knew that something untoward had happened. And when he bit at my boots and caught my trousers in his teeth, pulling me in the direction of the forest, a sudden sense of poignant bereavement shot through my heart that I found it hard to explain. And that must seem incredible to those who have never known how potent may be the conviction of a sudden intuition. I followed the forlorn creature whither it led, but before 100 yards lay behind us, I learned the facts from half a dozen mouths. That morning, very early before the countryside was awake, the first mountain train, swiftly descending the steep incline below Chambrelin, had caught Perret-Commonvat, just where the Mont Racine Sentier crosses the line on the way to his best beloved woods, and in one swift second had swept him into eternity. The spot was in the direct line he always took to that special woodland shrine, his holy place. And the manner of his death was characteristic of what I had divined in the man from the beginning, for he had given up his life to save his dog, this mongrel and faithful creature that now tugged so piteously at my trousers. Details, too, were not lacking. The engine driver had not failed to tell the story at the next station, and the news had traveled up the mountainside in the way that all such news travels, swiftly. Moreover, the woman who lived at the hut beside the crossing and lowered the wooden barriers at the approach of all trains had witnessed the whole sad scene from the beginning. And it is soon told. Neither she nor the engine driver knew exactly how the dog got caught in the rails, but both saw that it was caught, and both saw plainly how the figure of the half-witted wanderer, hatless as usual and with cape flying, moved deliberately across the line to release it. It all happened in a moment. The man could only have saved himself by leaving the dog to its fate. The shrieking whistle had as little effect upon him as the powerful brakes had upon the engine in those few available moments. Yet in the fraction of a second before the engine caught them, the dog somehow leapt free, and the soul of the man who played upon the leaf passed into the presence of his God, singing. As soon as it realized that I followed willingly, the beastie left me and trotted on ahead, turning every few minutes to make sure that I was coming. But I guessed our destination without difficulty. We passed the Pontarlier railway first, then climbed for half an hour, and crossed the mountain line about a mile above the scene of the disaster, and so eventually entered the region of the forest, still quivering with innumerable flowers, where in the shaded heart of trees we approached the spot of lilies that I knew, the place where a few weeks before the devout worshipper had lifted the hat from my head, because the earth whereon I stood was holy ground. We stood in the pillared gateway of his Holy of Holies. The cool airs, perfumed beyond belief, stole out of the forest to meet us on the very threshold, for the trees here grew so thickly that only patches of the summer blaze found an entrance. And this time I did not wait on the outskirts, but followed my four-footed guide to a group of mossy boulders that stood in the very center of the hollow. And there, as the dog raised its eyes to mine, soft with the pain of its great unanswerable question, I saw in a cleft of the gray rock the ashes of many hundred fires, and placed about them in careful array an assortment of the sacrifices he had offered, doubtless in sharp personal deprivation to his deity. Bits of moldy bread, half-loaves, untouched portions of cheese, salami with the skin uncut, most of it exactly as I had left it in his hut. And last of all, wrapped in the original white paper, the piece of Colombier plumcock, and a row of 10 silver francs round the edge. I learned afterwards, too, that among the almost unrecognizable remains on the railway, untouched by the devouring terror of the iron, they had found a hand, tightly clasping in its dead fingers a crumpled ivy leaf. My efforts to find a home for the dog delayed my departure, I remember, several days. But in the autumn, when I returned, it was only to hear that the creature had refused to stay with anyone, and finally had escaped into the forest and deliberately starved itself to death. They found its skeleton, Louis Favre told me, in a rocky hollow on the lower slopes of Mont Racine in the direction of Montmalin. But Louis Favre did not know, as I knew, that this hollow had received other sacrifices as well, and was consecrated ground. And somewhere, if you search well the Jura slopes between Champs de Moulins, where Jean-Jacques Rousseau had his temporary house, and Coton d'Argues, where he visited Lord Wemyss when Milord Marshal Keith was governor of the Principality of Neuchâtel under Frederick II, King of Prussia. If you look well these haunted slopes, somewhere between the vineyards and the gleaming limestone heights, you shall find the forest glade, where lie the bleached bones of the mongrel dog, and the little village cemetery that holds the remains of the man who played upon the leaf to the honor of the great god Pan. The man from the gods. That there was something wrong with all his work, Le Maistre well knew. Words and music, as the critics never failed to remind him, just missed that nameless something which would have made them good, perhaps great. Moreover, he was sane enough to realize that the blame lay not with an uncomprehending public, but simply with himself. The spark of inspiration that was beyond question in all his work never gathered to the flame stage. Thus his productions warmed people, but did not light them. He understood well enough what was lacking, and that no amount of mere painstaking work could put it right. But on one occasion, Le Maistre achieved a singular and startling success. As a sober record of fact, concealed by initials, it was reported in the Proceedings of the French Psychological Society for that year, and people who believed in the subliminal self, the higher ego, and all that consoling teaching about an attainable God within, made great havoc with the facts. The way it came about, moreover, probably has a profound psychical significance. In any case, the result remains as the very best kind of tangible proof, for it was the only great thing he ever really achieved. This fairy play, so-called, and its beauty was absolutely arresting. He was something over 50 when he wrote it in its original form. The central idea came to him with the quick flash of a genuine inspiration. So did most of the music. But in the working out of both, the fire had become smothered. The spark had never gathered into flame. The result was mediocrity. Yet, like so many artists, he confused what was in his mind and imagination with what he had actually set down upon paper. For when he went over the score to himself, he heard the original beauty in his thoughts and believed he had transferred into his work his own memory of that beauty. The music and words themselves, however, had not caught it. Thus, those who heard the preliminary recital in his rooms were more or less bored according to their powers of divination. "It's fine, it's original," they remarked, shaking their heads as they went home after the performance, "but just misses it." The transformation that changed the common lead into gold as by some mysterious process of spiritual alchemy came about as follows. The little play was finished, and Le Maistre, having his eye upon a certain manager, went to that particular theater one night in order to study the feel of it, to catch the flavor of the house, the size of the stage, and any other details he could. The management had given him a dress circle box, and he saw admirably. It was characteristic of the man, rather, that he put himself to this far-fetched kind of trouble. During the performance, his mind was keenly at work, yet he saw nothing of what was going on before his eyes. He had come with a definite purpose. He saw his own play all the time, heard his own music, watched his own creatures come on and go off among his own scenery. At the same time, the music, light and colorful, provided a stimulus that acted upon his own imagination and set all the finer machinery of his own creative genius working. Subconsciously, he revised his own work, with the illuminating result that a white light shone through his mind and showed up all the flaws, all the places where he had missed it, all the passages where he had trailed off into banality. And a tremendous desire went crashing through his being to revise his work in the light of this knowledge. I felt, he said, as though a great prayer had gone out of me, a cry, as it were, to my higher self to come to my assistance. Never in my life have I wished anything so intensely before. Then, in that curious fashion with which many artists must be familiar, it all faded again, and the reaction set in. The effort had no doubt exhausted him. He turned his attention to the actual performances on the stage before him, and lost the power to visualize his own piece. But the play, trivial, vulgar, and untrue to life, wearied him, and he withdrew into the back of the box and incontinently fell asleep upon the little plush sofa. When a considerable time later he woke up, the entire theater was dark and empty. The piece was over. The audience had gone home to a man, and the building was deserted. Le Maistre at once realized what had happened, though he could not understand why the final applause had not waked him, and hurried into his overcoat. A faint glimmer pervaded the vast auditorium, for as he leaned over the edge he could just make out the rows of empty stalls, the scattered white patches where the discarded programs lay, the music stands of the orchestra, and the exit doors of glass where the pit began. The air still smelt unpleasantly of a crowd, wraps, furs, stale scent, and cigarettes. Then he struck a match and saw by his watch that it was 2 o'clock in the morning. He had slept 3 hours. He pushed open the door and passed out into the passage, his one idea being how he could get out into the street, or how he would spend the time if he did not get out. He felt hungry, stiff, and a trifle chilly. Feeling his way along by the backs of the upper circle seats, he advanced slowly and carefully, his footsteps making no sound upon the soft carpet, and so came at last to the first exit door. It was locked and barred. He tried the next door with the same result. There was no other exit. Nothing but that narrow semicircular gangway between the wall and the seats, a box at either end, and the pillars at intervals to mark the distance. Like the exercise walk in a prison yard, he thought to himself, laughing. No single light was left burning anywhere in the building. Even the hall was in darkness. He saw the gilt-framed pictures of actors and actresses on the walls. A faint rumble from the streets reached him too. Voices, traffic, footsteps, wind. Then he turned back into the theater and carefully made his way down the aisle to the front, feeling the steps first with his toe and peering over into the body of the house. A sea of shadows swam to and fro below him. Here and there certain stalls picked themselves out of the general gloom almost as though they were occupied. He could easily imagine he saw figures still sitting in them. And it was here, just at this point, he said, that he began for the first time to feel a little uneasy. A slight tremor of the nerves passed over him, and sitting down in one of the front row seats, he considered the situation carefully and deliberately. There was not much to consider. He was shut in for the rest of the night. The dress circles seemed to be the limits of his prison. He could get neither up nor down. There was no escape till the morning. The prospect was not pleasant. Still, it was not very terrible, and his sense of humor would easily have carried him through with credit. But for one thing, this curiously disturbing sense of something he could not quite define. Of something that was going to happen, it seemed. It was too vague, too remote for him to deal with squarely. His mind, always keenly imaginative and pictorial, preferred to see it in terms of a picture. He thought of the Thames as he had sometimes seen it from the Chelsea embankment in the dusk, when dark barges, too far for their outline to be defined, come looming up through the mist. In this way, thoughts lie in the depths of the mind. In this way, they rise gradually before the consciousness. In this way, the cause of his present discomfort would presently reach the point where he would recognize it and understand. In similar fashion, he felt this something that moved at the back of his mind, coming slowly forward. A sudden idea came to him. If I could climb down to the auditorium floor, I might find a door open somewhere, or escape by way of the orchestra, perhaps. And the idea of action was pleasant, though how he climbed over the edge of the box in the dark and swarmed down the slippery pillar, landing with a crash upon the rim of the stage box below, he never quite understood. With a plunge, he dropped backwards into the dark space, kicking over as he did so a couple of chairs, which fell with a loud clatter and woke resounding echoes all through the empty building. That clatter seemed prodigious. He held his breath for several seconds to listen, standing motionless against the wall with the distinct idea that all this noise would attract attention to himself, and that if, after all, there was anyone watching him, that if among those shadows someone... Ah, he exclaimed quickly. Now I've got it. There is someone watching me in another part of the building. That's why I felt uneasy. That tumble into the box had shaken the thought up to the surface of his mind. The picture had emerged from the mist, and he recognized the cause of his uneasiness. All this time, though none of his senses had yet proved it to him, the mind of another person, perhaps the eyes too, had been focused upon him. He was not alone. Le Maistre felt no alarm, he said, but rather a definite thrill of exhilaration, as though the idea of this other person came to him with a sense of pleasurable excitement. His first instinct, to sit concealed in the corner of the box and await events, he dismissed almost at once in favor of some kind of prompt action. Stumbling in the gloom, he made his way down to the orchestra, and while groping cautiously among the crowded easels, his hand touched a tiny knob, and a dozen lights that bent over the music folios like little heads screened under black bonnets, sprang into brilliance. The first thing he noticed was that the fire curtain was down, closing the cavernous mouth of the stage. The shaded lights, however, were so carefully arranged that they fell only upon the music, and the main body of the theater still yawned in comparative darkness behind him. Vast and unfriendly it seemed, charged to the brim with faint shufflings and whispers, as though an audience sat there stealthily turning over programs. The stalls faced him like fixed but living beings. The balconies frowned down upon him. The boxes, especially the upper ones, had an air of concealing people behind their curtains. Far overhead glimmered a huge skylight. He heard the wind sighing across it like wind in the rigging of a ship. And more than once, he fancied he caught the faint tread of footsteps moving about among the stalls and gangways. Regretting that he had turned the lights up, they made him so conspicuous, so easily visible, he made an instinctive movement to turn them out again. But he touched the wrong knob, so that a row of lights flashed out up under the roof. In that topmost gallery of all, known as the Gods, a little line of starry lights leaped into being, and the first thing he noticed as he looked up was the figure of a man leaning over the edge of the railing, watching him. The same moment, he saw that this figure was making a movement of some kind, a gesture. It beckoned to him. So his feeling that someone was in the theater with him was justified. There had been a man in the Gods all the time. Le Maistre admitted frankly that, in his first surprise, he collapsed backwards upon the stool usually occupied by the second cello. But his alarm passed with a strange swiftness, and gave place almost immediately to a peculiar and deep-seated thrill. The instant he perceived this dim figure of a man up there under the roof, his heart leaped with an emotion that was partly delight, partly pleasurable anticipation, and partly, most curiously of all, awe. And in a voice that was unlike his own, and that carried across the intervening space, for all its faintness, with perfect ease, he heard the words driven out of him as if by command of some deeper instinct than he understood, yet the very last words that he could have imagined as appropriate. "You're up there in the Gods," he called out. "Won't you come down to me here?" And then the figure withdrew, and he heard the sound of the footsteps descending the winding passages and stairs behind, as their owner obeyed him and came. Alarmed, yet curiously exultant, Le Maistre stood up among the music easels to await his coming. He was extraordinarily alert, prepared. He fumbled again with the little switchboard under the conductor's desk, for he wished to see the man face to face in full light, not to be gradually approached in darkness. But the only thing that came of the button he pressed was a creaking noise behind him, and when he turned quickly to examine, lo and behold, he saw the huge fire curtain rising slowly and majestically into the air. And as it rose, revealing the stage beyond, he got the distinct impression that this very stage, now empty, had a moment before been crowded with a throng of living people, and that even now they were there concealed among the wings within a few feet of where he stood, waiting the summons to appear. Moreover, this discovery, far from causing him the kind of amazement that might have been expected, only communicated, for the second time within the space of a few minutes, another thrill of delight. Again, this lightning sense of exhilaration swept him from head to foot. The footsteps, meanwhile, came nearer, sometimes disappearing behind a thickness of walls that rendered them inaudible, and at other times starting suddenly into greater clearness as they came down from floor to floor. Le Maistre, unable to endure the suspense any longer, felt impelled to go forward and meet them halfway. An intense desire to see this stranger face to face came upon him. He climbed awkwardly over the orchestra railing and made his way past the first rows of the stalls. Already the steps sounded upon the same floor as himself. Hardly a dozen yards, to judge by the fall of these oddly cushioned footsteps, could now separate them. He moved more slowly, and the stranger moved more slowly too, entering at last the gangway in which he stood. And it is from this point, to use the words of the report he afterwards wrote for the Society, that my memory begins to fade somewhat, or rather, that the sense of bewilderment grew so astonishingly disturbing that I find it difficult to look back and recall with accuracy the true sequence of what followed. My normal measurement of the passage of time changed too, I think. All went so swiftly, almost as in a dream, though at the same time it did not appear to me to be short or hurried. But describe the sense of glory, wonder, and happiness that enveloped me as in a cloud, I simply cannot. As well might be a hashish eater, attempting during the dullness of next morning to reconstruct the phantasmal wonder of all he experienced the night before. Only, this was no fantasy. It was real and actual, and more palpitatingly vivid than any other experience of my life. I stood waiting in the gangway while this other person, the stranger, came towards me along the narrow space between the wall and the main body of seats. The footsteps were unhurried and regular. It was very dark. All I could see were two faint patches of light where the exit doors of the pit glimmered beyond. First one patch of light, then the other was temporarily obscured as he passed in front of these doors. Down he moved steadily towards me through the gloom, and at the barrier of velvet rope that separated the stalls from the pit, he stopped, just near enough for me to distinguish the head and shoulders of a man about my own height and about my own size. He stood facing me there, some 10 or 12 feet away. For a few seconds there was complete silence, like the silence in a mine, I remember thinking, and I instinctively clenched my fists, almost expecting something violent to happen. But the next instant the man spoke, and the moment I heard his voice all traces of fear left me, and I felt nothing but this peculiarly delightful sense of exhilaration I have already mentioned. It ran through me like the flush of a generous wine, rousing all my faculties, critical and imaginative, to their highest possible power, yet at the same time so bewildering me for the moment that I scarcely realized what I was saying, doing, or thinking. From this point I went through the whole scene without hesitation or dismay, certainly without a thought of disobeying. I mean, it was a pleasure to me to help it all forward, rather than to seek to prevent. "Here I am," said the man, in a voice wholly wonderful. "You called me down, and I have come." "You have come from up there, from the gods," I heard myself reply. "I have come from up there, from the gods," he answered, and his sentence seemed to mean so much more than mine did, although we used identical words. I held on to the back of the stall nearest to me. I could think for the moment of nothing further to say. The idea of what was coming thrilled me inexpressibly, though I could only hazard wild guesses as to its character. "Are you ready, then?" he asked. "Ready? Ready for what?" "For the rehearsal," he said. "The secret rehearsal." "The secret rehearsal?" I stammered, pretending as a child pretends in order to heighten its joy that I did not understand. "Of your play, you know, your fairy play," he finished the sentence. Then he moved towards me a few steps, and hardly knowing why, I retreated. It was still impossible to see his face. The curious idea came to me that there was something odd about the man that prevented, and that would always prevent, me getting closer to him, and that perhaps I should never see his face completely at all. I cannot point to anything definite that caused this impression. I can merely report that it was so. "Look," he went on, "everyone is ready and waiting. The moment the music starts, we can begin. You will find a violin down there. The rehearsal can go on at once." And although it struck me at the time as most curious he should be aware of the fact, it seemed quite natural, because I do play the violin, and in fact compose all my melodies first on that instrument before I put pen to paper. At the same time, I can remember faintly protesting. I remember asking, "I'm to play?" "Certainly," replied the soft-spoken figure among the shadows. "You're to play. Who else, pray? And see, everyone is ready and waiting." I was far too happily bewildered to object further. There seemed indeed no time for reflection at all. I felt impelled, driven forward, as it were, to go through with the adventure and to ask no questions. Besides, I wanted to go through with it. I felt the old power of the first inspiration upon me, only heightened. I felt in me the supreme and splendid confidence that I could do it all better than I had ever dreamed, do it perfectly as it should be done. I was borne forwards upon a wave of inspiration that nothing in the whole world could interfere with. And, as I turned to obey, I saw for the first time that the stage was brilliantly lighted, that the scenery was the scenery already chosen by my mind, that the performers thronged the wings and the opening characters were actually standing in their places waiting for the signal of the music to begin. The performers, moreover, I perceived, were identical in figure, feature, and bearing with those ideal performers who had already enacted the play upon the inner stage of my imagination. It was all, in fact, precisely as the original inspiration had come to me weeks ago, before the fires of beauty had faded during the wearisome toil of working it all out in limited terms upon the paper. The power that drove me forward, and at the same time filled me with this splendor of untrammeled creation, refused me, however, the least moment for consideration. I could only make my way into the orchestra and pick up the first violin case that came to hand, belonging doubtless to some member of the band I had listened to earlier in the evening. And all eyes were fixed upon me from the stage as I clambered into the conductor's seat and drew the bow across the strings to tune the instrument. At the first sound I realized that my fingers, accustomed to the harsh tones of my own cheaper fiddle, were now feeling their way over the exquisite nervous system of a genuine Guarnerius that responded instantly to the lightest touch, and that the bow in my right hand was so perfectly balanced that even the best torte ever made could only seem like a strip of raw, unfinished wood by comparison. For the bow swam over the strings, the sound streamed, smooth as honey, past my ears, and my fingers found the new intervals as easily as if they had never known any other keyboard. Harmonics, double stopping, and arpeggios issued from my efforts as perfectly as trills from the throat of a bird. In that moment I lived. I understood much. I heard my soul singing within me. I finished tuning and tapped sharply on the back of the violin to indicate that I was ready. And in the slight pause that ensued before I actually played the opening bars, I became aware that the stalls behind me, the boxes, the dress circle, and the whole house, in fact, right up to the gods, were crowded with eager listeners, and further, that the That man among the shadows in the background, standing ever beyond the reach of the light, still remained in some mysterious and potent fashion intimately in touch with my inner self, directing, helping, inspiring the performance from beginning to end. And in front of me upon the conductor's desk lay the score of my own music in clearest manuscript, no longer crossed out and corrected as it lay in my rooms after all the first passion of beauty had been ground out of it, but lovely and perfect as the original inspiration had rushed flame-like into my soul months before. The whole performance from that moment, rehearsal seems no adequate word to describe it, went with the smoothness of a dream from beginning to end. Just as the music was my own music made perfect, so the words and songs were the mature expression of the original conception before my blundering efforts had confined them, stammering and incomplete in broken form. Moreover, more wonderful still, I noticed the very places in my score where I had floundered, and where, in the laborious process of composition, the first inspiration had failed me and I had filled in with what was mediocre and banal. It was as if a master pointed out to me with the simplicity of true power the passages where the commonplace might pass, did pass by deft, inspiring touches into what was fine, moving, noble. The lesson was a sublime one. At the same time, however, it all seemed so ridiculously simple and easy that I felt I could never again write anything that was not great and splendid. Moreover, the acting, speaking, and dancing provided the perfect medium for my ideas, and the whole performance was the consummate representation of my first conception. Even the scenery shifted swiftly and noiselessly, and the intervals between the acts were hardly noticeable. And the end came with a curious abruptness, bringing me to myself, my limited, stammering, caged little self, as it seemed after these moments of intoxicating expression, with a sharp sense of pain that all was over. And I became aware that, without hurry, without noise, the entire audience that filled the huge building had risen to their feet like one man, and that thousands of hands were clapping silently the measure of their intense appreciation. From floor to ceiling and from wall to wall flew a great wave of emotion that swept their praise into me, gathered and focused into a single mighty draft of applause. It was, I remember thinking, all their thoughts of joy, their feelings of gratitude, beating in upon my soul in that form of praise which is the artist's only adequate reward. And it reminded me of nothing so much as the whirring of innumerable soft wings all rising through the air at the same moment. Pictorially in this fashion it came before my mind. Violin in hand, I rose too, and turned to face the auditorium, for I realized that they were calling for the author, for him who had ministered so adequately to their pleasure, and that I must be prepared to say something in reply. I had indeed made my first bow and was already casting about in my mind for suitable words when, for the first time during the whole adventure, something in me hesitated. Either it was that the sea of glimmering faces frightened me, or that I was obeying instinctively some faint warning that it was not myself but some other who was the true author of the play, and that it was for him these thousands before me clamored and called. But when, still hesitating in confusion, I turned again towards the stage, I saw that the great fire curtain had meanwhile descended, and that a footstep, regular and unhurried, was at that very moment coming forward towards the footlights. I heard the tread. I knew at once who it was. The stranger from the shadows behind me who had directed the entire performance was now moving to the front. It was he for whom the audience clamored. It was he who was the true author of the play. And instantly I clamored with them, forgetting my own small pain in a kind of delightful exultation that I, too, owed this man everything, and that I should at last see him face to face, and join my thanks and gratitude to theirs. Almost that same instant he appeared and stood before the center of the curtains, the glare of the footlights casting upwards into his face. And he looked not at the great throng behind and beyond me, but down into my own face, into my own eyes, smiling, approving.
his expression radiant with a glory I have never seen before or since upon any human countenance. And the stranger, I then realized, was myself. What happened next is so difficult to describe, though I scarcely know why it should be so, that I cannot hope to convey the reality of it properly, or paint the instantaneous manner in which he vanished and was gone. He neither faded nor moved, but in a second that seemed to have no perceptible duration, he was beside me, with me, in me. And this swift way he became suddenly merged into myself has always seemed to me the most amazing thing I have ever witnessed. The wave of delight and exultation swept into me anew. I felt for one brief moment that I was as a god, with a god's power of perfect expression. But for 1 second only. For at once, a new sound, terrible and overwhelming, rose in a flood and tore me away from all that I had ever known. And the sound was ugly and distressing, and darkness followed it. It was real clapping this time, the clapping of human hands, and an indifferent orchestra was playing a noisy march just below me with a great blare of brass out of tune. The lights were up all over the theater. The audience, busy with wraps and overcoats and applause, were hurrying out. I saw the actors and the actresses of the play bowing and scraping before the curtain, and the sight of the perspiration trickling down over the grease paint of the leading man directly beneath my box struck me like a blow in the face. Then came the frantic whistling for broughams and taxicabs and the hoarse shouting from the street where men cried the evening papers and the roar of the outer world. I picked up my opera hat, which had rolled into the middle of the floor while I had slept upon the sofa, scrambled into my overcoat, rushed out into the street, and told the driver of the first taxicab I found to drive for his life at double rates. And all that night, before the memory of the wonder and the glory faded, I worked upon my score of words and music, striving to get down on the paper something at least of what had been shown to me. How much, or how little I succeeded, it is now impossible to say. As I have already explained in this report, the memory faded with distressing swiftness. But I did my best. I hope, I believe, I am told at least, that there is something in the work that people like.